She bought a thrall to shed blood for her in the arena. After his victory, in a distant galaxy, far beyond the reaches of Earth, gladiatorial arenas were the heart of entertainment. From the grandest planets to the most remote outposts, the elite of the galaxy gathered to witness brutal combat between champions. Warriors were bought and sold like objects, their lives controlled by those who paid the highest price. This was a world where power was determined by the blood shed in the arena, and Lady Orina was one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in this system. Orina had everything she could desire: power, wealth, and a galaxy of enemies who feared her. Yet despite all of this, she felt a strange emptiness. She longed for something more than just victories in the political courts or the endless games of manipulation. What she craved was something real, something that could prove her strength not only in words but in actions. And so she decided to buy a thrall. Kale had once been a proud warrior, one of the fiercest in the galaxy. But after a crushing defeat in battle, he was sold into slavery, forced to fight in the arena to entertain the masses. His spirit had been broken long ago, and now he lived as little more than an instrument of violence, used for the amusement of those who held power. His past was filled with memories of a life he had lost, a life where he had been free to choose his own path. Now he was nothing more than a tool in a deadly game. Lady Orina had heard of Kale's reputation. His victories in the arena were legendary, but there was something about him that intrigued her. He wasn't like the other thralls. While most fighters fought with the desperation of those who had nothing to lose, Kale fought with a cold, calculated precision that set him apart. He never showed fear. He never showed weakness. It was as if he was already dead inside, and the arena was merely his grave. The first time Orina laid eyes on Kale, he was stepping out onto the sand of the arena. His tall, muscular frame was covered in scars, each one telling a story of survival. His eyes, cold and distant, seemed to look through everything and everyone, as if they could see into the heart of those who watched him. Orina felt a flicker of something: respect, perhaps, or maybe admiration. She was used to being in control, used to making people bend to her will, but Kale was different. She could sense that he had once been a leader, that he had once commanded armies and won battles. But now he was a prisoner, shackled by his circumstances. As the fight began, Orina couldn't take her eyes off him. His movements were effortless, graceful even, as he danced around his opponent. The crowd roared with excitement, but Kale seemed unaffected. Every strike he landed was precise, surgical. He was in control, and it was clear to everyone that no one could defeat him. When the match ended, Kale stood victorious, his expression unchanged, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a simple task. Orina was impressed. She had seen countless gladiators in her time, but none of them had ever captured her attention like Kale. She knew that he was more than just a fighter. He was a man who had been broken but not fully defeated, and that intrigued her. She had the power to buy him, to make him hers, to use him in her own games. But Orina didn't want to own him like a mere object. She wanted something more. She wanted him to be her champion, not just a tool in her battles, but a partner in her quest for power. She could see something in him that no one else did: potential. He could be the key to securing her position and crushing her rivals. But first, she had to make him see that he was more than just a slave. When the time came for her to purchase Kale, she did so without hesitation. The negotiations were swift, as they always were when someone with Orina's wealth and influence was involved. She paid a price far higher than anyone expected, but she didn't care. She wasn't buying Kale to win a fight. She was buying him to win something much more important: his loyalty. Kale was brought to her private estate, far from the arena. It was a place of luxury, filled with the finest things money could buy, but none of it mattered to Kale. He had seen wealth before, and it had never meant anything to him. He had been rich once too, and it had cost him everything. Now he was a prisoner of his own survival instincts, unwilling to trust anyone. Especially not someone like Orina, who seemed to see him as a tool, no different from any of the other thralls she owned. Orina, however, had a different approach. She did not force Kale into servitude. Instead, she offered him a place at her side, a chance to fight on his own terms. "I didn't buy you to be a slave," she told him. "I bought you to be a partner. I want you to fight for me, but I also want you to fight for yourself." At first, Kale did not respond. He had been manipulated and controlled for so long that the idea of fighting for someone else seemed absurd. But Orina's words lingered in his mind. Could he fight for something other than survival? Could he fight for a cause greater than himself? The next few weeks were difficult for both of them. Kale trained relentlessly, pushing his body beyond its limits, but his mind was still shackled by his past. Orina, on the other hand, watched him closely, studying him, understanding his every move. She knew that to break through the walls Kale had built around himself, she would have to be patient. She would have to earn his trust, something no one else had ever done. And then, one day, Kale fought again. This time, it wasn't in the arena. It was in a private training session, and Orina was his opponent. She was skilled in combat, but she was no match for Kale's strength and experience. Yet, despite his overwhelming advantage, Kale held back. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to fight her at all. Orina noticed the hesitation in his movements, and she smiled. "You still have something left inside you," she said, wiping the sweat from her brow. "You're not a machine, Kale, you're a man, and I see that man, not just the fighter." For the first time in a long time, Kale felt something stir inside him, not just respect for Orina, but something deeper. He had spent so long fighting for survival that he had forgotten what it was like to fight for something he believed in. And now, for the first time, he felt like he was fighting for himself. The connection between Kale and Orina grew stronger as they spent more time together. He began to open up, slowly at first, sharing stories of his past and the battles he had fought. Orina listened, not as a ruler commanding her thrall, but as a woman who saw him for who he truly was. She saw the strength in him, not just the muscle and skill, but the heart of a man who had been broken and reborn in the fire of the arena. The more Kale fought, the more he began to believe in his own worth. He wasn't just a slave. He was a champion. And for the first time, he saw Orina not as his master, but as his ally. Together, they would rise, not just in the arena, but in the galaxy itself. The battles they fought would not just be for survival. They would be for a future where they could be free, where they could choose their own destiny. But as the days passed, Kale knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There were powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to see Orina fall. They would use every weapon at their disposal, every trick in the book. But Kale was ready. He was ready to fight for her, ready to fight for himself. Ready to fight for the future they could create together. The arena had taken everything from him once, but now it was time to take it back. As the weeks went on, Kale's transformation became evident. In the quiet training chambers of Orina's estate, he honed his skills not just as a fighter, but as a man finding his way back from the brink of despair. Orina had given him something that no one else had, an opportunity. But what mattered most was that she treated him like a person, not a tool, and that made all the difference. Kale was no longer the broken man he had been when he first entered the arena. His movements were faster, more precise, as though each practice session brought him closer to the man he had once been. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. His mind was opening up to the idea that he might have a future beyond the blood-stained sands of the arena. His past still haunted him, but the chains that had bound him for so long seemed to loosen bit by bit. Orina watched him closely, her eyes sharp and calculating. She had never been one to take risks, yet she found herself constantly pushing Kale further. She would test him in new ways, asking him to think strategically, to use his surroundings to his advantage. And each time, Kale met her challenges head-on, his mind working like a well-oiled machine. They had a strange relationship, one that wasn't defined by the typical master-slave dynamic. Orina wasn't the kind of woman to coddle her slaves or make them feel safe. But she also wasn't like the others who simply saw her thralls as tools for their personal gain. She saw potential in Kale, potential that was more than just his ability to win fights. She saw someone who could change the entire system. And yet, despite their growing bond, Orina couldn't escape the pressure of the political games happening around her. Rival factions were beginning to take notice of her rising star. She had become a force to be reckoned with, and her enemies weren't going to let that slide. They would stop at nothing to tear her down, and Kale knew this better than anyone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kale sat alone in the courtyard, his back against a stone wall, lost in thought. The estate was quiet, except for the soft rustling of the wind and the occasional distant chatter of servants. It was in moments like these that he found himself reflecting on everything he had been through. The arena, the blood, the pain, the loss. But now things felt different. The weight that had once burdened him so heavily seemed lighter. Maybe it was the way Orina looked at him, or maybe it was the possibility of something more. A future. His life hadn't been his own for so long, but now he had choices. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a slave. He felt free. "You seem deep in thought," Orina's voice broke through his reverie. Cale turned his head to see her standing a few feet away, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp as always. She was dressed simply, a flowing gown of dark blue that seemed to match the night sky above. She didn't wear the usual trappings of wealth tonight, no extravagant jewels or gold, just her natural grace and presence. "I was thinking about what comes next," Cale said, his voice low. He stood and faced her. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again, a chance. But what happens when we've beaten every enemy we can see? What happens when the arena is no longer enough?" Orina's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. She understood what he meant. The arena was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. It was a distraction, a tool for control. But the real battle was out there in the corridors of power where her enemies were slowly tightening the noose. "That's a question we'll have to answer together," she said quietly. "But first, you need to trust me." Cale paused. Trust. It was a word he had learned to fear. After everything he had been through, trust felt like a luxury. He had been betrayed by those he once called allies, sold out by friends who had turned on him for their own gain. He had trusted people before, and it had cost him everything. "Trust is earned, not given," Cale replied, his voice firm but not unkind. Orina studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly," she said. "I'm asking you to trust that we can both get out of this alive. Trust that we can build something together, something that doesn't rely on bloodshed or the cruelty of the arena." Cale took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling in. He had fought for survival his whole life, but now he was fighting for something bigger. Something worth fighting for. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully trust anyone again, but for now, he could try. He could give this alliance with Orina a chance. "I'll fight for you," Cale said, his voice steady, "but only if we fight for something more than just victory." Orina's smile widened, but there was a hint of something else in her eyes. Something that told Cale she wasn't just talking about the fights ahead. She was talking about the fight for freedom, for control over their own destiny. The next few days were filled with preparation. Cale's training intensified, and Orina's political maneuvering grew even more calculated. She knew that the time for subtlety was running out. Her rivals were closing in, and they would strike soon if they saw any weakness. But Orina wasn't the type to show weakness. She was a force of nature, and Cale was becoming the weapon she had always needed. Together, they would not just fight for control of the arena, they would fight for control of everything. One night, as Cale trained in the courtyard, Orina approached him with a new challenge. She held out a small object in her hand, a metal key that gleamed in the dim light. "This is the key to the underground passage," she said. "We need to leave this place and find our next move. The danger is too great here. We have to act before they act." Cale looked at the key in her hand, and for the first time he saw the plan unfold. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about fighting for something greater, something that could change everything. "I'm ready," Cale said, his voice filled with determination. "Let's take control of our fate." Orina nodded, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Then we move tonight. The future is ours to take." The plan was simple: escape the estate, move through the underground passages, and get to a safe location where they could regroup. But there were dangers waiting in the shadows. Cale knew that his fight was far from over. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. The galaxy was vast, and its power structures were entrenched, but together, he and Orina could shatter them. As they made their way to the underground passage, Cale felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for a future. The underground passage was damp, its stone walls slick with moisture from the deep, hidden bowels of Orina's estate. The air was thick, carrying the smell of earth and stale water. Cale moved quietly, his footsteps muffled by the shadows that clung to the narrow corridor. Orina was a few paces ahead, her movements graceful but purposeful. Every so often, she would glance over her shoulder to make sure Cale was still with her. They had only just begun their escape, but the tension between them was already palpable. The plan was risky, far more dangerous than anything Cale had done before. They were leaving behind everything they had known, the comfort of the estate, the security of Orina's wealth, and the safety of the walls that had protected them for so long. But what they were moving toward was far more important: freedom. Cale couldn't help but think about the life he had left behind. The arena had once been everything to him. It was where he had fought for survival, for purpose, for the hope that one day he might be free. But even when he had won, even when he had stood victorious, he had felt empty. Now he was fighting for something greater, something that he wasn't sure he could fully understand yet. Orina was more than just his ally now. She was his partner, someone who had shown him that there was more to life than just survival. She had given him a glimpse of something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine in years: a future. As they reached a wider section of the passage, Orina paused. Cale, who had been walking silently beside her, stopped as well. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "We have to move quickly," she said quietly. "They'll be looking for us soon." Cale nodded. His mind was already racing, thinking about what lay ahead. They couldn't go back now. The risk was too great and the stakes too high. There was no turning back. "I'm ready," Cale said, his voice steady. Orina gave him a slight nod and led the way again. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper underground. Cale had never been down here before, but he could tell that the corridors weren't just a way to move through the estate unseen. They were a secret, a place where Orina had kept her most dangerous plans hidden from the eyes of her enemies. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They were both thinking, calculating the steps ahead, the dangers that might arise. The escape was only the first part of their plan. They had to make it to a safe location, a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. Cale could hear Orina's quiet breathing, and it made him realize just how far they had come since their first meeting. Back then, she had been a woman of immense power and wealth, a ruler in her own right. And Cale had been nothing more than a broken thrall, forced to fight in the arena for her amusement. Now they were equals, bound together by a shared goal. They both knew the stakes. If they failed, there would be no second chances. Eventually, the passage began to open up into a large chamber. The walls were lined with ancient stone carvings, depicting scenes of battles and victories, long-forgotten wars fought by people whose names were now lost to time. The chamber was dark, save for the faint glow of light from Orina's handheld torch. The air here felt heavier, almost as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Orina paused once more, looking around the chamber with a careful eye. She seemed to be searching for something, some hidden detail that Cale couldn't see. Her eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, moving toward a large stone pedestal in the center of the room. Cale followed closely behind. "This is it," Orina murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way out." Cale raised an eyebrow. The pedestal looked ordinary enough, just another piece of stonework worn down by the years. But something about it felt different, as if it were hiding something much more important than its outward appearance suggested. Orina stepped closer to the pedestal, her fingers brushing against the cool stone. She pushed on a hidden panel, and with a soft, grinding noise, a section of the floor began to shift. Slowly, a stone door slid open, revealing a narrow staircase that led up into the unknown. "Are you sure about this?" Cale asked, his voice tinged with concern. "We don't know what's waiting for us up there." Orina turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "If we don't take this chance now, we'll never get another one. It's the only way out." Cale didn't argue. He trusted her, perhaps more than he trusted anyone else in his life. They had come this far together, and now they had to see it through. Without another word, Orina led the way up the stairs. The climb was slow, each step creaking under their weight, the air growing colder as they ascended. Cale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that there were eyes on them from the shadows. He had been trained to sense danger, to always be aware of his surroundings, but there was no immediate threat. Still, the tension in the air was thick, and Cale felt every muscle in his body on edge. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the top of the stairs. The door at the end of the passage was old, made of rusted metal, its surface covered in layers of dust. Orina moved toward it with purpose, her hand resting on the handle. She glanced back at Cale one last time, as if making sure he was ready. Cale gave her a reassuring nod, though the uncertainty in his heart remained. With a deep breath, Orina turned the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. The air outside was cool, crisp, and smelled of fresh earth. They had made it out, but this wasn't over. They weren't free yet. The world outside was vast, and their enemies were everywhere. Orina's enemies, and now Cale's too. There was no place for them to hide anymore, no more walls to protect them. They were stepping into a world of uncertainty, a world where survival meant more than just winning battles. Kale stepped out into the open, taking in his surroundings. The night sky stretched above them, dotted with countless stars, a reminder of how small they really were in the grand scheme of things. But for the first time in a long while, Kale didn't feel small. He felt alive. Orina stood beside him, her expression determined, but there was something softer in her eyes now. The two of them were standing on the threshold of something great. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were ready to take back what was theirs, ready to carve out their own future, no matter the cost. "We're free," Kale said, his voice low, almost as if he couldn't quite believe it. For the first time since they had met, Orina smiled. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Now we fight for what really matters." The night was still, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Kale and Orina had left the safety of the estate far behind, stepping into the unknown. The world outside was vast and dangerous, filled with the kind of uncertainties that made Kale's skin tingle with awareness. He had been a fighter for most of his life, but now, for the first time, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something else. He was fighting for a future. Orina walked beside him, her steps firm and confident. The cold night air seemed to settle around them like a shroud, but she didn't appear to be bothered by it. The journey ahead would be perilous, but Orina had never been one to back down from danger. Kale could see that now more than ever. She had been a ruler, a master of intrigue and manipulation, but she was also strong. She had survived countless battles, both in the arena and in the halls of power. "I can feel their eyes on us," Kale said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He had spent years fighting in the arena, learning to read the signs of danger before it was too late. He knew they were being followed. Orina didn't break her stride. "I know," she said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "We won't stop, we can't." Kale nodded. He didn't need to ask why. There was no turning back now. The decision had been made, and there was no safety left for them in the old world. They had crossed the point of no return. The political games, the manipulation, and the control, it was all part of a system they were no longer a part of. They moved quickly, cutting across the open fields that surrounded the estate. It was still dark, and the ground beneath them was soft and uneven, but Kale's senses were sharp. He could hear the rustle of leaves, the distant howling of wind through the trees, and the faint crunch of footsteps behind them. He knew they weren't alone. After a few moments, Orina stopped and turned to face him. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Kale's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to answer. The sound of footsteps, soft but steady, was unmistakable. They were being pursued. The question now was how long they had before the pursuers caught up. "We have to make it to the safe house," Orina said, her voice low but firm. "It's not far from here, but we need to keep moving. We can't let them catch us." Kale didn't argue. They both knew the consequences of being caught. Orina had enemies, powerful ones, who would do whatever it took to bring her down. And Kale. He was a former slave, a thrall, a man who had been broken and sold for the amusement of the rich and powerful. They would stop at nothing to get rid of him, too. They ran, their feet pounding the earth beneath them. The wind cut through the air, but neither of them slowed. Every so often, Kale would glance behind them, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, a tightness that came from knowing how close they were to being caught. But he pushed it aside. They had to make it to the safe house. It was their only chance. As they ran, Kale's thoughts turned back to the time they had spent in the estate. It had been weeks since he had first met Orina, and in that time everything had changed. She had shown him a side of the world he had never imagined, one where people fought not just for survival, but for something bigger. She had given him hope, and now it was up to him to protect that hope. Orina had been different from the other masters Kale had served. She didn't see him as a tool, a weapon to be used in her games. She saw him as something more. And in turn, Kale had come to see her in a different light, not as a ruler who held power over him, but as someone who was fighting for a better future. It was a strange kind of partnership, but it was a partnership nonetheless. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, they reached the edge of a dense forest. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches twisting toward the sky. The safe house, as Orina had called it, was hidden deep within the woods, far from prying eyes. It was a place where Orina could regroup and plan her next move, away from the constant surveillance of her enemies. As they entered the forest, the darkness seemed to envelop them, the trees blocking out the light of the stars. It was a place of shadows, but to Kale it felt like a place of refuge. Here in the silence of the woods they could rest. For a moment they could be free. Orna led the way, her pace steady despite the long journey. Kale followed close behind, his senses alert, his body tense. They had to keep moving, but every instinct in Kale's body told him that something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavy, as though something were watching them from the darkness. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the trees. Kale's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his eyes scanning the shadows, but he saw nothing. His breath came in quick bursts as he tried to steady himself. Orna had stopped, too, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Stay close," she said quietly. "I don't like this." Kale didn't question her. He knew that if Orna was uneasy, then there was a real threat. They weren't alone in the woods. The question was who was following them and what did they want? The sound of movement grew louder, and then, without warning, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Kale's hand went instinctively to the weapon at his side, but the figure raised its hands in a gesture of peace. "It's not them," the man said, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Orna's gaze flickered over the man, studying him with suspicion. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man stepped forward, his face illuminated by the faint light of the stars. He was tall, with short, dark hair and a lean, muscular build. He wore a simple cloak that blended into the shadows, making him almost invisible in the darkness. "My name is Joran," the man said. "I was sent by those who oppose your enemies. They want to help." Kale tensed, his fingers still gripping the hilt of his weapon. "Why should we trust you?" Joran's eyes softened, and he lowered his hands slowly. "Because I've seen what happens to those who fight alone," he said. "And I've seen what happens to those who trust the wrong people. I'm offering you a chance, but it's up to you whether or not you take it." Orna stepped forward, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on Joran. "And who exactly are they?" "They're the ones who want to see the system fall," Joran said. "The ones who want to change things. They've been watching you, Orna. They know what you can do, and they think you might be the key to bringing down those who control everything." Kale could see the hesitation in Orna's eyes. She wasn't used to trusting others, especially strangers, but Kale knew that this could be their only chance. They couldn't keep running forever. "Why now?" Kale asked, his voice steady. "Why wait until now to help?" Joran's expression darkened. "Because now is the time. Your enemies are closing in, and if you don't act soon, it will be too late." Orna stood still for a moment, her mind working quickly, weighing the risks. Finally, she nodded. "Lead the way," she said, her voice low and determined. Joran motioned for them to follow. As they moved deeper into the forest, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pulled into something much bigger than they had ever imagined. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something that could change the fate of the galaxy. The question now was whether they were ready for it. The night was still dark, but Kale felt something shift in the air. They were no longer just running from their enemies. They were about to face a battle that would define the rest of their lives. The forest was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the trees and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Kale and Orna followed Joran through the dense underbrush, their footsteps silent as they moved deeper into the heart of the woods. The air had grown colder, the night growing thicker around them as the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. Kale's mind was racing. He had no idea who Joran really was or who he represented. All he knew was that this man, this stranger, was offering them something they desperately needed, help. But help from whom, and at what cost? He glanced at Orna, who walked beside him, her eyes sharp and calculating as always. She hadn't said much since they met Joran, her expression unreadable. She trusted no one easily, and Kale could see that she was just as uncertain about this new alliance as he was. But there was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and they couldn't afford to hesitate. Joran led them to a clearing where the trees gave way to a small camp. A fire burned brightly in the center, its flames flickering and casting long shadows across the faces of the people gathered around it. There were 5 others in the camp, men and women, all dressed in simple, practical clothes, their expressions serious but welcoming. "This is where we rest for the night," Joran said, his voice calm as he turned to face them. "I'll explain everything in the morning. You've had a long day." Kale didn't argue. He was tired, his body sore from the long run, and the weight of the night's events was beginning to catch up with him. But even as he sat down by the fire, his mind was still racing. He had always been a man of action, used to making decisions on the fly. But this time, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. And with every step they took, they were getting closer to a confrontation they weren't yet ready for. Orina sat beside him, her posture straight and dignified, but Cale could see the weariness in her eyes. She had been through more than anyone should ever endure, and yet she still carried herself like a queen, calm, composed, and determined. But Cale knew better. He knew the weight she carried, the pressure of being a target, the constant threat from enemies who would stop at nothing to see her fall. As Joran and the others began preparing a meal over the fire, Orina turned to Cale, her voice low but steady. "Do you think we can trust them?" Cale thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know, but right now we don't have many options. We have to take the chance." Orina nodded, her gaze never leaving the fire. She didn't speak again, and Cale didn't press her. They both knew the risks, but there was no choice. They couldn't keep running forever. They had to fight, and they had to fight smart. Joran eventually returned to them, his eyes flicking between the two of them as he sat down by the fire. "I know this isn't easy," he said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying urgency. "You're both running from powerful enemies, and I can't promise you safety. But I can promise you this, we're not alone. There are others out there who want to see the system fall. People who have been watching you, Orina, people who know what you're capable of." Orina's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are these people?" Joran didn't hesitate. "We're a resistance group. We've been working in the shadows for years, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with you and Cale, we have that moment." Cale could see the skepticism in Orina's eyes. She wasn't someone who would easily place her trust in a group of strangers. But there was something in Joran's voice, something that hinted at sincerity, that made Cale think this wasn't just another false promise. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. "And what do you want from us?" Orina asked, her voice sharp. "We need your support," Joran said, his gaze unwavering. "You have influence, power, you have the means to bring about change. We can't do this without you." Orina leaned back slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "And what's in it for me?" she asked, her tone cold but not dismissive. "I didn't escape my life of power just to join a rebellion." "We're not asking you to give up your power," Joran said. "We're asking you to use it. Together, we can destroy the system that keeps people like Cale enslaved. We can destroy the ones who have kept you trapped in your own game of politics." Orina didn't respond right away. She stared into the fire, her mind clearly working through the options in her head. Cale could see the internal struggle, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. For someone who had always been in control, who had always been the one pulling the strings, this was a huge shift. This wasn't about power, it was about something bigger. It was about freeing people, breaking the chains of the system they had both been forced into. Cale watched her, his own thoughts swirling. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something more, something he hadn't allowed himself to think about for years. Maybe, just maybe, they could change the galaxy. They could tear down the system that had kept people like them oppressed and build something new, something better. Finally, Orina spoke. "I'll help, but this isn't just about taking down our enemies. This is about taking control of our own future. If we do this, we do it on our terms." Joran's face softened into a smile, but it was brief. "Agreed, we'll do it together." The group settled into the camp for the night, and Cale found himself thinking about what had just been said. There was no turning back now. They had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the consequences. In the morning, they would move forward. The fight ahead would not be easy. They would face enemies far more powerful than they had ever imagined, and the road would be filled with danger. But for the first time in a long while, Cale felt something stirring inside him. It was hope. And it was something he hadn't felt in years. Orina leaned over to Cale as they sat by the fire, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think we can do this?" Cale looked at her, his eyes steady. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try." Orina smiled slightly. "Then let's do it." The sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the camp. It was a new day and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for something bigger. Together, they would face the battles ahead, and no matter what happened, they would do it on their own terms. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the camp, Cale felt the weight of the journey ahead. But this time, it wasn't the weight of survival. It was the weight of a new purpose, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to fight for.